So a big welcome to you all, and especially to Francesca Stavrakopoulou, who is professor in Exeter, and has written this book, and it looks beautiful and it is a wonderful read. I have, it's one of my books of the year. I was saying we're nearly at the end of the year, so
thank you.
It is really good. And so if I'm going to try and not over enthuse too much in case you want to ask, challenging questions, but it's a really good read. And Francesca, this is the book you wish you had read at university. So why?
I think I went to university to learn more about Jesus, which makes me sound like I'd been converted. I hadn't. I was an atheist. I was brought up in a non-religious household, but I'd always been really interested in Greek gods and goddesses. I'm of Greek heritage, and I couldn't work out why Jesus, who's had a divine father and a mortal mother, how come this guy had managed to survive into the modern day when all these other gods and goddesses and semi-divine beings and heroes from the ancient world hadn't. So I got bitten by the bug and really wanted to find out more about ancient Judaism and Christianity, and then discovered the Hebrew Bible. I'd not been taught it at school. We'd only done a bit of New Testament stuff. And I just loved it. And it was just thrilling to read these really vivid, colourful stories about these ancient figures, but also about this incredibly dynamic, frightening deity who seemed to me to fit very much into this mold that, of the sorts of things I'd been reading when I was a bit younger. But no one was talking about this at university. And this is what I thought I'd go to university to study. I did a theology degree at Oxford. And no one really talked about it.
No one talked about what?
About the mythological aspects of this incredible deity in the Bible, both in the New Testament and in the Hebrew Bible. We talked about, various theological constructs, literary constructs, historical, all that kind of stuff. But no one sort of really explored, why this deity seemed to be so mythologically human, I suppose, superhuman. We would talk about anthropomorphic imagery in these texts, but I never understood why people wouldn't go much further than that.
They didn't talk about the fact that God had a body.
Exactly. And I was reading a lot of other ancient Southwest Asian mythology when I was at university, from the Levant and from obviously Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. And there seemed to be such sharp differences between some of these depictions of deities, but also some incredible similarities. And everyone was very comfortable to talk about the body of Marduk, for example, but no one was very comfortable talking about the body of the biblical God.
Why do you think that was?
It was a theology degree, which means that it was a certain version of the past told through a Western Christian lens. And I think it was just kind of a part of that academic culture, and not just in Oxford, but, throughout other Western European and American institutions, particularly, that this was somehow to talk about God as having a body was somehow a primitive or unsophisticated interpretation of these texts. That this was purely, poetry or metaphor or, literary artistry. And people weren't really interested. I think they just weren't in that mindset to see these texts, set them within the sort of mythological context.
So it sort of betrays the assumption, first of all, that other religions are sort of primitive in comparison to the ancient Israelite religion, but also that maybe the religion of the Israelites wasn't like other religions, which of course is a discussion that happens within the text itself, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the huge ideological themes of Hebrew Bible texts in particular, but also you see these debates happening obviously in New Testament texts and other Second Temple texts, is that there is somehow not exceptionalism, but what makes this God different is that he is not like other deities, and and Yahweh is very insistent on saying that. And I think, that's not something that was distinctive to ancient Israelite religion. You find that in other sorts of ancient religions too, that somehow this deity is different. But I think theologically, that obviously becomes a really important anchor for a lot of the post-biblical religious ideas. So in other words, Judaism and Christianity, I don't see them as biblical religions in the sense that, that a lot of the texts that I deal with in this book are looking at ancient Israelite, ancient Judahite, ancient Judean, and, some diaspora Babylonian, Phoenician context too, actually. And so there's a sense in which it's the post-biblical God who has been read back into these ancient texts rather than this ancient deity.
The text that you're looking at with the Hebrew Bible, they were sort of they're the very earliest of the 8th century through to the 2nd century BCE, and the God of the Bible. Let's just hear a little bit about the God of the Bible. He's Yahweh, and he's got a family tree. He's not the Father God. Just very briefly tell us who he is.
Yeah, I mean, it looks, most Hebrew Bible specialists would agree that we have little sort of fossilized mythological tropes in some of our very earliest texts. So it looks like Yahweh originally was perhaps regarded as one of the sons of the high god El, who has apportioned this people who are later known as Jacob or Israel. And so he sort of forms a part of this much broader heavenly household. And we know much more about what that heavenly household might have looked like from various other ancient texts. But yeah, one of the big points I make at the beginning of the book is that the idea of having a solitary God, a God who's not networked into a broader heavenly household, if you like, would have been extraordinary in the ancient world. I mean, to be without the benefits of collaboration and kinship, the heavenly household reflected to a certain extent the social dynamics of their worship, of the God's worshippers. And so, yeah, you can see from a history of religions perspective how gradually Yahweh is prioritized over and above other deities, becomes identified with El, takes on a lot of his roles and functions in sanctuaries. But he also, takes on a lot of the roles and functions of other deities who are really important across the Levant, particularly the southern Levant. So deities like Baal or Hadad or Adad, as he's sometimes known, even goddesses like this warring goddess Anat, and mother goddess figure too. He takes on a lot of those roles. So I think most scholars would agree that originally, when this deity first emerges, he was networked into a much wider heavenly world, heavenly household, but is increasingly prioritized.
So you're clear that the references when God's body is being spoken about, it's not being spoken about metaphorically. This is a God who's got this very big and human, gigantic, but largely human body. And he goes around trampling sea monsters under his feet and so on. And there are a couple of I really love the chapter about the feet. Just tell us about Yahweh and his feet and his shoes and his footstool.
I think that's it. I mean, so a lot of this imagery, so even though some of these texts are drawing on, are using ideas about God's feet or his shoes for very particular sorts of purposes. Originally his worshippers understood that, all worshippers thought that gods essentially had human-shaped bodies. More importantly, that humans had God-shaped bodies. I mean, that's a really important point of correspondence. But one of the most striking texts is in Exodus 24, when Moses and some of the tribal leaders go up to the top of Mount Sinai. And we're told that, and they saw, that beneath God's feet, they see this beautiful lapis lazuli brickwork. And then, in the next verse, which is something that's often missed by commentators, it says, and they saw the God of Israel. So a lot of biblical texts are very comfortable with seeing, with alluding to or referencing the fact that this was a deity who could be seen. But his feet were extraordinary because he talks about his feet a lot in the Hebrew Bible. He describes Jerusalem as the place for the soles of my feet, the place, where I will dwell forever. And it's that sense of permanence and placement, and the idea that any temple, but particularly the Jerusalem temple, was the dwelling place, the chosen dwelling place of this deity, is really important. And so feet, in that sense, play quite a proprietorial role. This is about his territory, his temple, his place, where he is grounded, if you like. And that maps onto all sorts of other ideas about power. I mean, kings and pharaohs and other deities use their feet in extraordinarily varied ways to demonstrate territorialism, political power, the idea of conquering and subduing peoples and monsters and places and territories. And so you can see this kind of language being worked out to the point where you get something, as we find in the Psalms, where Yahweh says he's going to hurl his shoe on an enemy territory. To us, like that might look like a temper tantrum, but within an ancient Southern Levantine and Southwest Asian context, this is very much language about the idea that bodies, human and divine, were almost partible. So the sense that your shoe could not just symbolize but manifest your presence, and so by hurling his shoe on this enemy territory, he is essentially trampling these foreigners down. So
there's loads that could be said about feet, but this God is unambiguously male, isn't he? Isaiah sees the Lord in the temple, and I once used to sing a song which was, he is high and lifted up and his train filled the temple, and I thought this meant his long gown, and you think it means something quite different.
I think we need to be open to the possibility that it means something different, and it's not my theory, it's something that was suggested several decades and decades ago. We're very used to seeing this language of it talks about the lower extremities of God filling the temple. And we're very used to reading this language as referring to the edge of a garment, because that's often how it's used in some of the priestly writings of the Hebrew Bible that we tend to find in the Torah. But in prophetic literature in which this text appears, it's more usually used to index ideas about genitalia. And a lot of commentators are very happy to see that term being used to talk about genitalia when it comes to female genitalia. So we find that a huge amount in the prophets, but they're not so comfortable sort of playing with the idea that this could be alluding to the lower extremities, the lower genital parts of God. And it maps onto a slightly later text in the book of Ezekiel, in chapter 1, where the prophet sees this human-shaped deity on the throne, and the top half of his body is this kind of fiery, dazzling, mysterious quality, as does the lower half of his body. But the one part that the prophet leaves exposed is his motnaim, which means kind of, normally translated as loins, but is often used to refer to, to the bits of our body that are right in front of our pelvis, our genital area. So I think there's a lot of correspondence between those two texts. But this is also setting it within the wider context of the ways in which this God is portrayed in many texts, particularly in the prophets, as not just a masculine God, but a sexual God, a God who is capable of in theory, having a sex life, for want of a better phrase, which we find in several
texts. And he's got a wife who's Asherah, and what happens to her is very interesting. We might come to that later if we've got time. What does it mean for the relationship between God and the people of Israel that God loses his body?
What does it mean? What do you mean? What does it mean?
Well, maybe we'll come back to one of our guests later, I suppose. If God's losing his body, that means God is being worshipped in a different way and understood in a different way.
I think that's the thing. I think in terms of ritual practice, the Torah scrolls come to play the role of what had been the role of cult statues in earlier periods. But in terms of the relationship between God and his people, to a certain extent, God didn't lose his body within ancient Judaism. I mean, rabbinic tradition is so fabulously rich, full of these very vivid stories that continue to envisage God as having a human-shaped body or a human-like body. So it continues in a really, really rich rabbinic vein. As it continues in a very rich mystical Jewish vein. It's the idea that human eyes, human perceptions can't cope in some of these traditions with encountering just the sheer godliness of God. There's one fantastic text, Jewish mystical text that talks about fire springing out from God's eyes and sort of would burn up both his angels and humans if they ever looked upon him. These are all playing with much older ideas about how dangerous it is to encounter a deity, but at the same time it's translating those much older motifs and traditions, adapting them to glorify God, to say how other he is. So to be completely transcendent and other doesn't mean to be a deity completely disembodied, which is very much what some Christians were doing when they were talking about God being embodied in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. So it's not a clear, so what I'm trying to say is, we can't be binary about this. It's not a body or no body. I think the notion of God's body actually persists for far longer than perhaps we might think. And certainly,
Yeah, and you suggest that God's body lasts much more in Jewish thought than in Christian thought, but you do write an autopsy of his body at the end, so I reckon you kill him off, really, don't you? A final question before I come to other people. Why does it matter that we don't see God's body? If we don't see God's body, why does that matter?
I think it depends on your point of view. I mean, I'm not a religious person. Perhaps if I were Jewish or Christian, I might feel a God who is not embodied, particularly a God who is not male or masculine. I might find that rather more appealing, because there's a hierarchy of bodies in a lot of these ancient religious texts, both Jewish and Christian. And in that hierarchy, women's bodies don't come up very high at all. And those whose bodies deviate somehow from this idealized, often very hyper-masculine ideal, are seen as lesser people socially as well as theologically. Why does it matter that God is disembodied for others? I wrote this book because I wanted to tell this story. It's a story as much about the ancient societies that gave rise to these traditions as it is about the nature of the deity himself. And I wanted people to see that, nobody owns the Bible or their view of God. This is in a world in which a lot of the most popular forms of, say, Christianity are very evangelical, Pentecostal primarily, and what the Bible says matters and what the Bible says is true. And that can be used as a stick to beat other people with, people who deviate from some of these, some of the evangelical preferences. I think it's great to point out that actually these texts don't necessarily mean what you think they mean, and the fluidity of these traditions means that we can continue to make God in our own image.
Lovely, thank you so much. Now we've got half an hour, and so I might come to some of you and I might ask you a question, but if you want to ignore the question and say something else, that's fine. If I really want you to answer it, I'll put it again. But Catherine Southwood, you're an associate professor at St John's in Oxford. Are you going to put this on the book list for your undergraduates before they come and start their studying with you?
Yes, absolutely, I am. I'm actually reviewing the book at the moment for the Church Times, and so I've been really enjoying reading that. I think part of the reason I want to put it on the reading list is for the course Gender and Power that I'm teaching at the moment. And I think one of the things that I find it really important that emerges from this book is about the way God is depicted in the biblical texts. So I mean, there's a lot of engagement with scholarship in this book. The arguments that emerge come out of a wealth of research from within the field. So for me, this is very, very familiar territory. And I think that quite a lot of the argumentation in the book is persuasive. I think I'm especially in support of the way that the research uncovers these ideas about gender and power embedded within the biblical texts. So many of the texts in the Hebrew Bible quite problematically depict Israel as a woman, using sexualized metaphors. For example, equating idolatry with adultery, or worship of other gods with prostitution. And I think these kind of things can be damaging and problematic. For example, for evidence of how problematic this idea of a kind of macho, hyper-masculine depiction of a deity couched in sexualized language can be, look at a recent project that some academics are doing, I think in Leeds, Joanna Siebert, that she got it's an AHLC funded project called
the Shiloh Project.
Yeah, and I think, as biblical scholars, we have a responsibility to steward or to curate the biblical texts carefully and to read them ethically. And I think that's really important. And I think actually part of doing that is to make sure that we engage with the public rather than kind of just sitting and pontificating in ivory towers and writing material that only other academics can read, or that will go straight to the stacks in the Bodleian. And I think that Professor Stavrakopoulous' book is a really good example of this. So yes, it very much is going straight on my reading list for the gender and power course.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I just come to Shoshana Boyd-Gelfand? Shoshana, you're a rabbi, and you've done a lot of work in this area of gender and power and God. How do you respond to what Francesca and Catherine have just said?
I haven't read the book yet, but I'm going to now. It sounds absolutely fascinating. And it very much fits with my own training. I mean, I was trained at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, where we studied history of Bible, right? That was very, very different than when I'm standing there reading out of the Torah. Right? The hat that I'm wearing is a different hat. And it sounds a little bit strange, but there can be moments in my life where when I'm reading from the Torah, I very much feel, God's word flowing through me, and I would never change any bit of the text at all, because there's something bigger going on that is spiritual, and that's very different from being in the classroom. So I'd be shocked if this wasn't going to be on the reading list at my seminary, because trying to understand the development of Jewish history, of Jewish theology throughout history, is very much part of the ethos that I ascribe to. And thinking about an ancient text in the context of the societies that it was either sort of engaging with or a polemic against. So, as you're talking, I'm thinking about how often I teach the Bible as a polemic against Egypt, right? And that explains certain things, like why this anathema for priests to be near the dead. Right? Well, that's because, in Egypt, the priests were the ones who had the secret knowledge who could get you from here to the next world. So it was a way of distancing oneself from Egypt, saying we are different. And unless you know that, you just go, what is this? So I feel like what you're doing is sort of helping us into a world where we try and see, why was the Israelite religion, and I purposefully use that word, Israelite religion, because it's different from Judaism today. So how was the Israelite religion navigating its social, cultural, and cultish environment? So I'm very much looking forward to reading it and exploring that more. And I think it's an important conversation starter to separate out what the history of religion perspective is from the practice of religion.
Thank you.
I think that's I think that's a really important point, because so many of these texts are written within a context of colonial oppression for the writers themselves, the scribes themselves. And so something like, a move away from God's body, when the writer of Second Isaiah is taking the mickey out of the Babylonian cult statues, is sort of saying, Bel stoops and, these cult statues are tottering on these animals that are carrying them. I mean, I think it's a really important, how do you punch up when you've been, downtrodden? And I see that a lot of this shifting theological ideas of the deity from the period of the Babylonian exile onwards very much reflects that trying to disempower these colonial oppressors by saying our God is nothing like your God. And I think that's a really important point. But I completely agree that this is about setting these texts in their social and historical and political and emotional contexts quite often.
Francesca, I hope you'll just interrupt whenever, because I can't always see you if I'm seeing somebody else. But can I just ask Rabbi Jonathan Romain, what have you heard that sort of strikes you in particular this morning?
Well, I think many rabbis today, and many Jews actually, would be absolutely horrified by what Francesca had said, but that doesn't mean to say you're not right. Because I think what this calls for is sort of religious honesty in two senses. Firstly, that we really don't know an awful lot about the Bible period. We've only got the Bible's word for it and not enough contemporary records. We assume a lot, but in fact, as you've shown, there's an awful amount of back reading that goes on, which is sort of coloured or miscoloured, really, our view of what the actual situation was back in the day. It also applies not just to academics, of course, but to religious leaders. It sort of begs the question, is the Bible the final word, or is it just one stage of a sort of religious evolution, which I think you've made quite clear. And the Jewish answer, I suppose, to that question is yes to both. In other words, the rabbis have this sort of balancing act of saying, well, yes, the Bible is our core text, and we always go back to it, but as everybody here on the screen will know, we are not biblical Jews, we're rabbinic Jews, because the Bible has been, some would say, superseded by the rabbinic literature, other people would say refined by biblical literature, depending on your point of view. I must say I did cheat a little bit because I'd actually a certain amount of preparation for today's thing, because as it happens, a few months ago I had to review another book which has got curiously similar title. I don't know if you've seen it, God's Body. Although this came out about 5 years ago in German and has only just been translated into English, but it doesn't concentrate as much as you do on the biblical text, because it looks at quite a lot of the pagan and classical texts as well. And let me just end with two other thoughts. You mentioned Ezekiel, and it's very interesting. Ezekiel is quite astonishing if you read it from as a modern Jewish point of view. And that's why it's really been kicked into touch. And it's really been demoted. It's not part of the Torah. It's very little read. And certainly the difficult passages are exercised out. And it's nothing to do with us today. And finally, Maimonides, the great rationalist rabbi of the 12th century. This is the question, really. He makes an interesting comment on sacrifices, which I don't know might apply to this. And he says very clearly, a little bit heretically for some, that actually sacrifices were never really that important in themselves, and therefore it didn't matter they went. He said it was really God's sort of method of weaning the Israelites from polytheism to monotheism, and they couldn't make that jump without taking a little bit of the polytheism with them. And so when the sacrifices ended, that's why we didn't replace them, because they'd done their job and we got on the monotheistic train. And I wonder whether you'd come across any references to him saying something like that, because he makes it very clear in his Guide for the Perplexed that all these images are anthropomorphic and shouldn't be taken seriously. But I don't know if there are any references where he says, but they are quite helpful to let people understand.
Yeah, and he absolutely does. I finish in I end up talking about Maimonides and pointing out that he says, yes, this very human-like behavior of God, these human-like body parts of God, yes, they are in the Torah, they are in our scriptures. And he says, but these are just useful devices. So he employs a similar strategy. These are useful devices to help to draw Jewish people into their text, into understanding their text, so that they can therefore begin to learn to perceive the greater revelations. I like the way that Maimonides, we always think of him as this very rationalist, philosophical scholar, but he uses a lot, it seems to me, and I'm not an expert on medieval Judaism at all, but he seems to me to use a lot of the same tactics that mystic writers were also using, who might seem kind of diametrically opposed to him. But by saying that it's only by being drawn into the text that its further revelations and secrets are revealed. And so he says that this anthropomorphic imagery used for God is a device to draw worshippers in. You read the Torah, you understand the Torah, you reflect on Torah, and then you perceive that these were just it's picture language to help, the uninitiated or the simple thinkers to kind of think their way theologically to the greater truths of God. What an incredible scholar he was, actually, but that's for another day.
We've said, Adrian Thatcher, we've said, or Francesca Johnson said that, a lot of Jewish people would be sort of, horrified by some of the things they might not have known about in the book about God and his body. Do you think some Christians might be similarly discomforted?
Yeah, I think lots of Christians will be discomforted, but that's a very good thing, isn't it?
Why though?
Well, because I think they have a very idealized understanding of who and what God is, and what this book does. I mean, one of the many things that it does is that it gives, I think, a really unique insight into how the ancient Hebrews thought about God, what their perceptions of God were. And so it gives us a really remarkable understanding of the context in which ideas of God arose, which of course the Christians inherited. Now, as for contemporary Christians, among Protestants, of course, ever since the Reformation, wanted to get back to ad fontes, to the very words of Scripture, because this was the word of God. Well, that's what Francesca's done. She hasn't done it how they would do it, and it's all the better for that. So we have a new understanding of the God of the Hebrew Bible, and I really think that what she's done is on a par with other episodes in the history of Christian theology that have caused real problems, but there's been a way through them.
I mean, have you seen Christians writing about and discussing the book and saying we don't like this aspect of it, or this?
Well, it's too early, and also conservative Christians have the habit of ignoring anything that they don't like, or pretending not to recognize it. So it wouldn't surprise me if the book gets cold treatment from.
Yeah, she's an atheist after all.
Yeah, exactly. She's an atheist after all. But there are liberal traditions in Christianity which welcome, say, evolution, or welcome a heliocentric view of the universe going back several centuries. These things caused enormous problems at the time, but that's how a living tradition develops. Really, it has to grapple with what is not itself, and to deal with that. And I mean, I look forward to lots of discussion within Christianity about Francesca's book, because the insights in it, I mean, they are genuinely going to aid what we take God to be.
Stephen Patterson, can I come to you?
Yeah, hi, yes. Well, I want to say that I've read all 583 pages of the book and I really enjoyed it. And thank you, Francesca, for writing it. But I'm kind of feeling a bit sorry for you in this discussion, because everybody here sort of agrees with you and says, oh, well, we knew that God didn't have a body. But yeah, as Adrian is saying, I think there are a lot of people who have a very particular view of the Bible, which is in fact that it sort of is progressive and that we move from embodiment to abstraction, and somehow this mirrors the human race and the progress of religion and so on and so forth. So I suppose I'm prompted to ask the question, who are you hoping will read the book? Do you think they are reading it? What do you hope will happen? We're paid to write books, and you could say, well, it's nice to get it out of your system, but I suppose as an author, you're really wanting perhaps something to happen as a result of it, and for people to perhaps change their views or come to a different way of doing things. So what is your hope for the book, and what sort of responses have you had? And if you think it's stuck in this strange liberal bubble that we seem to share here, how are you going to get it outside of that bubble?
That's such a good question, because I didn't write this book for my colleagues or for Jewish people or for Christian people. I wrote this book for people like me who are atheists, but also for people who who are so disinterested in religion or the Bible. I wanted people to see that the Bible isn't boring. It's not a dusty, irrelevant relic of the past. So in that sense, that's what I wanted to study when I was at university. I wanted to know more about the religious realities of the past. And so that's the book. So I've written the book for people like me. And in that sense, the response has been fantastic, because, you know, from Twitter to email to book events to all sorts of things, I get people saying, I would never have thought to pick up this book, but I heard you on the radio and I read it and it's amazing. I'm really interested. What else can I read? Or I want to go and study this at university, or that, and genuinely, hand on heart, that's why I wrote the book, because we hear so much, particularly with the current government, so many references every day to, you know, this classical allusion and, you know, this bit of Latin or this bit of Greek or blah, blah, blah. But the world wasn't, you know, and I say this as a half Greek person, the world was not made in the image of Greece. Like the Bible has played such a huge part in our cultural, our shaping and our identity and the things that we take for granted or assume, and particularly ancient Southwest Asian context of biblical texts. So, you know, all the way from what is now Iran and Iraq to Egypt. And I just thought it's important to get this stuff out there, and to show people that the Bible really is not boring. Gosh, that's very passionate of me. I suddenly but yeah, they're the people that I wrote the book for. So, you know, Rowan Williams, I think he wrote a long review, and it was very Rowan Williams. It was kind of going off on this big springboard, who was taking issue with me about, you know, what is the real God of the Bible? You know, the point I was trying to make is that the God of Christianity and the God of Judaism today is not the same deity as the deity that we find in New Testament texts or the Dead Sea Scrolls or Hebrew Bible texts, or, you know, it's a different kind of deity. If
anyone wants to take issue with that, does anyone want to take issue with that statement?
No, I just think that Francesca is kind of dodging the question of whether the change in language and the change in imagery used is in any sense an improvement in understanding the world. I mean, as an atheist, do you think there is no difference whatever between God striding around like a gigantic, you know, warrior, or God as imagined by Rowan Williams? Or do you think that there's some actual genuine progress of some sort involved in the transition?
It's interesting because people often use the language of evolution or development or you know, that kind of a sense, and somehow it's progression, it's getting better. Personally
it could be getting worse, but I mean, does it actually change our understanding of the world? That's what I want to know.
I think it changes our understanding of the past and our ancestors, and I think that's what's important. And I use ancestors in a very broad sense. I didn't write a book to change the world. Perhaps that's where I'm going wrong. Maybe I should have done. I don't know. But I think that giving a different voice to those voices that are deliberately marginalised, both by conventional scholarship and by the theological preferences of Judaisms and Christianities today, and those voices that are marginalised by the biblical writers themselves, I think that's an improvement. It's to better understand the context out of which these come. So I'm interested to know, am I still dodging your question? I'm not sure.
Well, I think you're talking about your book, and I was talking about the general progress of, I'd actually use progress, the general change in the understandings of God that your book charts.
Yeah, I mean, I think a polytheistic system works much better than a monotheistic system, and you can see the ways, historically, the ways in which Christianity and Judaism have struggled with a pure monotheism. And I kind of, you know, there are various sorts of things that we are very glad to see consigned to the past. I'm glad animal sacrifice, for example, isn't a mainstream feature of worship within this particular tradition. But, you know, there are some things that I rather like about this ancient version or flavour of this particular form of worship. And
sure. Okay, the interesting question from that is if polytheism is more realistic, and in some ways it obviously is, we're all polytheistic inside ourselves, why did monotheism take over?
Well, has it? Well, that's the thing, though. I mean, I don't think it strictly has. Judaism and Christianity and Islam too have got all sorts of, you know, a huge cast of non-human, semi-divine or divine characters. So I think, strictly speaking, theoretically, these are monotheistic religions. But it seems to me the book is about as much about what it is to be human as it is about God and the nature of God, and it's the sociality of those aspects. And the thing about humans is that we have bodies, and everything that we think, feel, experience, encounter is by means of our bodies. And so until the point where we're all living as artificial forms of intelligence on computer screens, which it kind of feels a little bit like, you know, most of the time in the last 2 years, but I think we'd find it very difficult to get away from humanizing, no matter how loftily abstract our monotheistic theologies are. I think we find it very hard to get away from humanizing, socializing God in our own image. So why not, rather than having this kind of Diet Coke or decaf coffee version of a relationship with a social God, let's go back to full fat, and let's have the idea that this is a God who has a body like us.
Anyone want to come back in? People who've already spoken, or even a couple of people haven't spoken, but Catherine, Shoshana, Jonathan?
Well, just to say that evolution, both in life and in religion, doesn't operate in a straight line. And I think the same applies here, because we see quite an enormous variety of views in the Bible. I mean, just to quote one book, the book of Numbers, you know, on the one hand, we have in chapter 6 talking about the face of God, and then a few chapters later saying, I think it's chapter 22 or 23, God is not a man. And there's competing views. So in a sense, many of today's arguments are also raging within the Bible. And assuming we accept there are different authors, you know, there's quite a lot of religious politics going on, even back then.
I think it's very clear, isn't it, that God is not a woman. And I just wonder, Shoshana, whether there's very few crumbs for comfort for some feminists in Francesca's book. I mean, even the sort of the milky God and the God with breasts, I think Francesca, you suggest, is a function of a male deity, not a female one, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that imagery that and I can completely understand why some women in particular, but also those who would rather have a genderqueer or gender-free deity would take great comfort in some of those images, you know, by setting them in the context in which those texts were written. So it's not to dismiss the reinterpretation, but by pointing out in this context to be a wet nurse or a midwife or a mother, these were socio-political roles. You know, these were not necessarily biological roles. I felt it was quite important to point that out. But yeah, to shut up and let others speak.
Shoshana?
Again, I just go back to what is the Hebrew Bible reacting against? And it is reacting against paganism. That is, you know, and I don't know why it's making that move. That's a really interesting question, right? Why are we moving from paganism to monotheism at this period of time? I don't know. I would love to know that, but we are, and everything in there is railing against it. So I think, you know, I'm imagining a context where the feminine fertility is huge for them, and therefore you end up with them pushing away any of that imagery and really focusing on the male. I don't find that problematic as a feminist. I just it's just what was happening at that time in history, and I see it very much being, you know, reclaimed at other periods in history where you know, where other stereotypically feminine aspects of religiosity get reincorporated. But at this time, it's clear to me that there's a real push against that, and this is creating probably, I would imagine, again, I'm not a scholar, but I would imagine, against a strong force of matriarchy in some way, or of a powerful woman, and pushing against that to create quite a patriarchal structure, but not patriarchal. And I guess I want to reclaim that word. Patriarchal is not bad. Patriarchal is a descriptive word, and that is what it is.
Francesca, do you want to respond to that, or does anyone want to respond to that?
I think I'd agree just by saying that this, yeah, there were certainly goddesses I mean, fertility itself was always seen as a very masculine trait, which surprised me when I first realized that. But yeah, there were various goddesses around and about, and I think that with, you know, when you read something like in Jeremiah, they're talking about this goddess who's deliberately not named, this anonymous goddess called the Queen of Heaven, and Jeremiah is shouting at people saying, why do you keep worshipping the Queen of Heaven? And they say, these women say, well, when we worshipped her, our husbands and our sons and our children do this too, but when we worshipped her, we had state security, we had protection from military forces, we had food, we had grain, we had all this and that. And since we stopped worshipping her, devastation has occurred and the Babylonians have come in. So this was not good. So in other words, this was a goddess who was not just all about fertility. She was this kind of military, powerful goddess, whoever she was, closely identified with Jerusalem and Judah. To be a god who can protect and, from colonial power, the only option wasn't to be a masculine god. There were other options too. I mean, look at Ishtar, for example, in all over Babylonia. Look at the role of Anat, particularly a Levantine goddess who's hugely important in Egypt. There were other options, gendered options. But, Yahweh just happens to be a male deity, and Yahweh happens to be the deity who had always been patron of the political elites, I suppose, that we associate with the emergence of kingship in Israel and Judah. So yeah, I again, to answer the question about the evolution or progression or development of religion, I would very much welcome the return of a strong female role in the heavens.
Catherine Southwood wants to add something. I'm afraid this probably has to be the last comment, everybody, because it's time for lunch.
Okay, well, I'm glad I've got in there then. I want to say three things very, very briefly. I think it's important to note that actually this book emerges from a Leverhulme grant. It's nestled away in the acknowledgements at the end, but I think these things are worth recognising. It's very, very difficult to get grants and competitive, and so I did just want to point that out. There are two other things. First, I think there's a little bit of a confusion about what a biblical scholar actually is, what a biblical scholar does, because everybody feels that
can't hear you very well, Catherine.
Sorry.
Confusion about what a biblical scholar is.
Did you get any of that? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Great. So I think that there is a bit of confusion about what exactly a biblical scholar is. Everybody feels entitled to talk about the Bible, but not everyone is trained. And the biblical texts, biblical scholars are sort of like analogous to ancient historians. We engage with the biblical text as part of our primary evidence, but we're also looking to papyri, inscriptions, archaeology, ostraca, and so on. So it really is just the tip of the iceberg. And I think one of the merits of the book is the way that so fluently Professor Stavrakopoulou engages with all this other material too. And I think the third thing, it's been mentioned in the conversation that Professor Stavrakopoulou is an atheist. And I think that one of the things that biblical scholars are taught to do is question the Sitzin Leben, or the setting in life of the biblical text. And one of the things that we maybe ought to do a little bit more is think about the Sitzin Leben of the person as well. And I think that there is a level of honesty in acknowledging that, and acknowledging that no perspectives are neutral, regardless of where we come from. And I just wanted to say again, how much I've enjoyed reading this book.
Right, well, that's lovely. Everyone, it is 1 o'clock, time for lunch. Thank you so much for joining us. I've really enjoyed the discussion. I hope you have too. Do sign up for the Religion Media Centre and join us again on another Zoom soon. Thanks, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.